Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the rhetoric of policy documents. So what I mean by policy documents in this instance is the sets of rules or guidelines that organizations, institutions, companies, whatever it is, create in order to guide people's behavior. So things like employee handbooks, academic codes of conduct, these kinds of things. Now, when I started thinking about this video, I was thinking I don't have that much policy document experience, right? It's not my primary area of expertise. It's really like to write policy documents is a specific rhetorical exercise. It requires particular strategies and techniques, and it's not my field. It's not what I do. But then I started thinking more about it, and I actually realized I do have some policy document experience in the form of every semester I write 1 to 2 syllabi, depending on how many course preps I have for that semester, right? And these are policy documents as well. So I have that experience. I also recently, from time of filming, was going through a whole bunch of Penn State's policy documents about sexual harassment and physical assault because I am creating and piloting this summer semester an incident report assignment where my students have to use policy documents to recommend what should be done about an incident taking place in Zapkin, my fictional company. So, from those things, as well as I was on a working group to draft the initial committee description for Penn State English Department's Anti-Racism and Equity Committee. So some of the things that I think are central to policy documents based on my experience here. One is that these are typically written in legalese. So what that means basically is legal language, the language of contracts, the language of law, the language of governance, of like bills and things like that going through Congress, what have you. This is written in specific ways for specific purposes. Partly it is to sort of conform to the broad genre of legal rhetoric, right? Everybody writes like this, and so everybody has to write like this in order to be consistent. But it's also a highly technical approach to language in which specific word choice matters. And part of this is because a lot of what lawyers do is to focus on specific wording, right? So you think about something like, so if I have a contract, right? Let's say I sign my contract with Penn State, and I have thought, I have misunderstood something in that contract, right? If the language says something that I interpret one way, but Penn State interprets another way, that can become a source of conflict, right? And so part of the idea of legalese is to avoid as much as possible any potential misunderstandings. So it is a very regimented, very rhetorically regulated system of language in which things like specific definitions for terms are given, even if those terms might seem self-evident, right? So like the Penn State policy documents for, I think it's called general mischief, something like that. Like they have a definitions section, and one of the definitions will be claimant or complainant, right? And they basically say this is the person bringing the complaint against whoever it is that is accused of doing something, right? So it's this kind of thing, right? Where like even words that might seem like they are going to be self-evident will be defined in specific ways, and then they mean that specific thing throughout the document. Ideally, within policy rhetoric, there is little or no room for interpretation, misinterpretation especially. I mean, there's little to no wiggle room in terms of what these documents mean. This is part of the reason why you will sometimes see people like when a government bill is written in such a way that the language is ambiguous, right? People will often talk about that, depending on what sort of news you follow, right? They'll talk about how, okay, here's what the stated intent of this bill is, but the way that it is written, it opens the door to this set of interpretations, some of which would be unconstitutional, right? You see this all the time, right? So there was a big push, and there still is a push for this, but it seems to have sort of gotten swallowed up into other anti-trans legislation. But for a while, there was a big push about we got to ban drag performance, right? And most drag performers are not trans, but that doesn't matter for the purposes of these bills, right? And of course, the fact that that is a way of sort of skirting around actually overtly targeting trans people is part of the appeal for transphobic legislators. But, right, these sort of ideas that were like, these bills that were trying to avoid saying we want to specifically ban drag performance because that would be unconstitutional, they would often sort of default to language like adult performance with children present or something like that. And that, of course, opens the door to massive amounts of misinterpretation of what that might mean. So again, this is one of those things, right? You do see this sometimes where a policy, whether that's and the ones that make the news in my experience tend to be governmental bills, right? Where they are so vaguely written or poorly written that it's clear that there is an intent behind them that is illegal, but they're written in such a broad way that they try and skirt that illegality by opening the door for massive misinterpretation of what the bill does. But this is this is part of the rhetoric of policy documents, right? Is that in principle, they are supposed to be very clear and very specific, but in a specific, clear, jargony way, which means that for most of us, they're fucking nonsense. They're just insanely difficult to read. They are boring. And in fairness, they're not meant to be thrilling, right? They're not meant to be an exciting read. They're meant to serve a specific rhetorical purpose, which is to lay out the policy clearly and explicitly. But again, because it is in legalese, most normal human beings who are not trained in reading legalese or who are not good high-level critical readers really struggle to understand them. This is part of the reason that none of us read the terms and conditions before agreeing to services, right? We just scroll down to the bottom and say, yeah, I read it, click, I agree, right? We don't know what's in them. And in part, there's actually an argument, which I think is probably quite right, that legalese is specifically dense and obscure and difficult to read so that people will not read it because that protects corporations rather than consumers, right? But anyway, apart from that. So this is the sort of one of the main functions of it. The rhetoric of policy documents is to be difficult to read because that allows a great deal of specificity, right? And often within policy documents along those same lines, you will have a lot of caveats or a lot of specific exemptions to the rule, exceptions to the rule, whatever it is. And this is part of the reason why you tend to have a lot of sections and subsections within policy documents, right? So a section will unite a broad category of stuff, and then subsections deal with individual bits and pieces of it, right? So in my syllabus, for instance, this is my business writing syllabus from this previous spring semester. I have a section heading here for policies, and then I have subsections for attendance, the academic integrity statement, the student disability resources subsection, etc., etc. And it's worth noting a lot of these subsections are much longer and more dense than I would write. This is boilerplate, and I will talk about boilerplate in just a minute. But part of the reason that you have those sections and subsections is so that you can develop all of those details. And typically these subsections have a specific focus. You may even have subsections, right? You can go Russian nesting doll style smaller and smaller and smaller if you want to. Or if it's necessary to. But part of the reason that you have these sections and subsections is to unite information in that's all relevant to the same point. So that's what a section does, right? It puts all of the information relevant to this specific thing, in this case, course policies, whatever it is, making a complaint to human resources might be a section of a employee handbook. Professional behavior in the workplace might be a section in an employee handbook. And then within those, you'd have subsections, right? So within professional behavior, you might have a dress code. You might have information about punctuality. You might have whatever it is, right? So the section unites a bunch of stuff that's all related to one another, and then the subsections will give you specific points within it. So more detailed stuff. So it's a way of organizing connections and divisions in a way, right? So the connections will be, this stuff is all related to the broad topic of the section heading, but here's specific pieces separated out into subsections. And again, this is about specificity, it's about detail, it's about making sure that every point that needs to be covered is covered. And part of the way that you figure that out is through trial and error, right? And this is especially true with something like syllabus building, because we build a new syllabus for every course, but the syllabi are on the same basic framework most of the time, right? So and sometimes we completely restructure them, right? But I've taught English 202D since 2018, I think. I think was when I first taught this class, this business writing class. This syllabus looks reasonably similar. A lot of the content is reasonably similar. The parts that I have written are generally at least somewhat similar to the first syllabi that I created when I was teaching this course, because you use the same thing over and over and over. There's no need to reinvent the wheel here. However, what you also do, and again, this happens anytime you have a policy update, right? And frequently if you look at policy documents on like a company's website or something like this, or a university's website, an organization's website, nonprofit, NGO, whatever it is, they will often have a date that policy was written and then a date it was most recently updated, right? So syllabi work like that, just they get updated more regularly than most policies, because each semester, at the very least, we need to put in the right section number, we need to put in the right room number, the right time, the right schedule for that semester, etc., right? And one of the things that you do as an instructor writing syllabi semester after semester after semester is say, okay, what problems have I encountered? And what concerns have students raised in the course evaluations? And what of those do I need to build into my syllabus, right? So one thing, for instance, this is one that I added a couple of semesters ago now, I think. In my attendance policy, it now says, you're not going to be able to read that. I'm not going to be able to read it from that angle. Unless I explicitly grant you an extension, you must still meet assignment deadlines regardless of attendance. Now, that might to you seem self-evident. To me, it seemed self-evident, right? That even if you have an excused absence for the day an assignment is due, the assignment is still due unless you also ask me about getting an extension. But at some point, I had students who turned work in late and when I graded it and they lost points for it being late, they said, well, I had an excused absence. I thought that meant I had an extension. And I had to say, no, that isn't how it works. And so you then build that into the syllabus, right? So this is a big part of how policy documents tend to come together, is that some kind of problem crops up that you, the writer of the policy documents, did not anticipate. And then when you update them, you incorporate that new information in to make the policy more comprehensive and hopefully to make it work better. So the other thing that I want to talk about in terms of the rhetoric of policy documents is what we call boilerplate or boilerplate language. And this basically is language that is sort of officially mandated on some level, right? So through the program in writing and rhetoric here at Penn State, those of us who teach the first year composition course and the sort of upper level specialty writing courses, we have to include specific PWR approved language for the academic integrity statement, student disability resources, counseling and psychological services, reporting educational equity concerns through the report bias site, and the COVID statement. Everybody has to include those. They have to say exactly the same thing, etc., etc. This is what we call boilerplate, right? It is, the idea would sort of be it's mass manufactured language, right? That's the boilerplate idea, right? So boilerplate basically, you could sort of think of it as like industrially manufactured stuff that would be consistent, right? Every boiler in the United States would have the same make, the same model, whatever it is. That's not exactly true, but every boiler from a particular company, right, basically is a mass manufacturing thing. So this happens a lot where like, but in practice, a better way of thinking about it probably is that this is centrally dictated and every policy within a particular organization, institution, company, whatever it is, needs to use that same language. So it will be centrally dictated by, say, Penn State, for instance. Like if Penn State says every syllabus in the university has to use this, then each department, each individual syllabus would use it. If you work at a company, the company might say every policy document needs to use this specific language about this specific topic. And so every department, whether it's sales, whether it's human resources, whether it's communications, whether it's public relations, whatever it is, every department in their policies, you will find exactly the same language because it's centrally dictated. And this is about consistency, and it's about ensuring that those policies do not conflict with one another, that everything is coherent across the board so that, again, the organization or institution or company or whatever it is, so that their lawyers can say, this is the policy, everyone is aware of it, right? And that's ultimately what policy documents are really about, is about conveying that information.